Rudine, can you tell me what is the Dodd-Frank risk retention rule?
Certainly. It's a joint rule that's been adopted by an alphabet soup of agencies, including most notably the OCC, FHFA, SEC. As you can see, we really like acronyms in my world. But basically, it requires securitizers to maintain a portion of the credit risk for assets that they securitize. That's a big fancy way of saying that you want to make sure that the financial interests of your securitizers are aligned with those of your investors. You want to make sure your sponsors have skin in the game.
And those are risks that they really are burdened by. Can they offload those risks?
No, the risk retention rules specifically prohibit them from selling, transferring, or hedging the retained risk in a way that would minimize their financial exposure. It would defeat the entire purpose of having credit risk retention rules if somehow they could avoid it by offloading it to other people.
Okay, so what is the risk retention rule doing to the world of securitization? Is it slowing things down, or are there less transactions because of the obligation to comply with the rule? Are different people playing in that space? Tell me what's different.
In anticipation of the rule, I will say that the lore of the credit risk retention rules had people nervous, and so they were a little skeptical and hesitant about actually doing transactions because no one really understood, well, do I want to be the first person to go out there and do eligible horizontal risk retention? What if I get it wrong? But we've had some time under our belt to get accustomed to the new rules. For example, the RMBS guys have been, residential mortgage-backed securities guys have been sort of under this new rule regime since December of 2015. So they've had, a long, steep learning curve, but they've gotten comfortable. There are deals out there that do eligible vertical interest. There are deals that do eligible horizontal residual interest. What is eligible vertical interest? Well, basically, if you have an issuing entity, that issuing entity has to retain, or sponsor has to retain 5% of the ABS interest for all interest that that issuing entity issues. So for example,
if there are 4 different levels of notes, A, B, C, D, they've got 5% of each of those.
Correct. And then they also have to retain 5% of the equity. That's eligible vertical. So think about it as like a sliver, a vertical sliver. For eligible horizontal residual interest, what that needs to be is an interest in classes that represent the most subordinated claim to payment. So if there are losses on the underlying assets, the interest that's first hit, the first loss piece, that would be an eligible horizontal interest.
Why would anybody go with the horizontal risk when they can diversify their risk by taking the vertical risk?
That's a very good question. And I think in a lot of situations, the people who sort of opt for that eligible horizontal residual interest are people who would automatically have to retain that anyway. They're retaining the most subordinated pieces in their securitization to begin with. Some probably far in excess of 5%, so it's not really difficult for them. It's not a real challenge for them to retain that risk.
And I assume there's a higher rate of return that's allocated to that level of risk, is that right?
Correct, because it's the riskier piece.
Mm-hmm. But what would the damage be? Wouldn't it just be the same 5% loss that an investor could claim was, absent of fraud?
Right. So it's, again, so if they've done their calculations correctly, their exposure is 5%. And according to how the agencies who came up with the rule, they thought that was enough of a financial pinch to address those perverse incentives that I talked about earlier. Of course, failure to comply with the risk retention rules is a violation of the securities laws, and no one wants to be in a position where they're violating securities laws.